The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, but at this moment, it felt like a stage for humiliation. The young boy stood there, hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling in silent defiance as the officer loomed over him. His mother sat just a few feet away, her presence strong yet unaware of what was about to unfold. The officer smirked, his thick fingers twitching at his side as he took a step closer. "You think you deserve this?" His voice was laced with mockery, his eyes scanning the gold chain that rested against the boy's collarbone. "A kid like you, wearing something like that?" He scoffed, shaking his head as if the very thought disgusted him. The boy's throat tightened, but he refused to look away. The officer didn't wait for a response. With a quick, violent tug, he ripped the chain from the boy's neck. The sharp edges of the pendant scraped against his skin, leaving behind a faint red mark. The room gasped in shock, the murmurs rippling through the courtroom like a growing wave, but the officer ignored them. He held up the gold chain between his fingers, letting it dangle in the air like a prize, like a trophy he had just seized from someone unworthy. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, his voice just low enough that only the boy could hear. "People like you never do." The boy's heart pounded. His fists trembled at his sides, his body rigid as if every muscle inside him screamed to react. But he couldn't. Not here. Not now. His mother's presence was the only thing keeping him grounded, her calm authority a silent reminder that he had to stay in control. But the fire burned. The shame, the rage, the unbearable weight of being treated like nothing in a room full of people who said nothing. The officer's smirk grew wider, his arrogance unchecked. Someone gasped. A rustle of movement came from the judge's bench. The officer's smirk faltered just slightly as he glanced toward the front of the courtroom, sensing that something was off. But his arrogance was louder than his instincts. He chuckled to himself, pocketing the chain as if he had done nothing wrong. "What? You think someone's gonna stop me?" he sneered, looking around the room with fake innocence. "I was just confiscating stolen property." The words hit like a slap. The boy's jaw clenched so tight it hurt. His chain wasn't stolen. It was his. His father's. The only thing he had left of him. And this man, this so-called officer of the law, had just taken it like it meant nothing. The officer turned away, his victory secured, or so he thought. But the air shifted. A silence stretched across the room, thick and suffocating. The sound of heels clicking against the wooden floor cut through the tension, each step slow, deliberate. The officer frowned slightly, turning his head. And then, he saw her. The judge. The boy's mother. The realization crashed into him all at once, his face twitching as his mind scrambled to process what he had just done. His eyes darted between the boy and the woman now standing before him, her expression unreadable. But the cold fire in her eyes? That was unmistakable. The courtroom had changed. It was no longer his playground. No longer a place where his power was unchecked. Because now he had messed with the wrong boy. And what happened next, would shake everyone to the core. Hey, family. Here at Plough of Twist, we stand against all forms of racism. We believe in justice, respect, and dignity for all. If you've ever felt discriminated against, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you are powerful. This story isn't just fiction, it's a reflection of the real world, a reminder that change starts with accountability. So sit back, stay locked in, and get ready for a story full of twists, karma, and justice served cold. And hey, make sure to subscribe to Plough of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The morning air in Atlanta carried a weight that settled deep in the bones, a thick humidity that pressed against the skin and made every movement feel heavier, more deliberate. The streets hummed with life, car horns blaring, voices overlapping, the rhythmic pulse of a city that never truly rested. But inside the courthouse, a different kind of energy thrived, a quiet tension woven into the walls, lingering in the marble floors and heavy wooden benches, a suffocating blend of authority and apprehension. It was a place built on the illusion of fairness, where justice was supposed to be blind but too often peeked through narrowed eyes, where the weight of history pressed down on those who had always been told to wait their turn. Today was supposed to be just another day in this grand, towering building of law and order, but for Malik Carter, it was about to become a moment that would etch itself into his memory, a moment of humiliation, fury, and something even more dangerous, a reckoning. Malik walked through the courthouse doors alongside his mother, Judge Camille Carter, a woman who carried herself with the kind of presence that turned heads and straightened backs. She wasn't just another judge, she was a force, a name spoken with respect and sometimes fear, a woman who had climbed her way through a system designed to keep her out and had made sure her son would never have to bow to it. But despite all her victories, despite the battles she had fought and won, she knew there were wars still being waged in moments just like these, in silent glances, in words unsaid, in the way a black boy standing too confidently could be perceived as a challenge. Malik was 16, tall for his age but still lean, his posture straight but not stiff, his expression unreadable but not empty. He had learned early how to hold himself in places like this, how to move without looking like he was trying to prove something, how to exist in a world that had already decided what it thought of him. And around his neck, resting against his chest, was the gold chain. His father's. The only thing of his that Malik had left. It wasn't just metal, it was memory, legacy, proof that someone before him had walked this road and survived it. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and the faint, lingering trace of coffee, the kind that had been left to burn on a pot for hours. Lawyers moved through the halls with an air of quiet urgency, their suits crisp, their gazes sharp. Defendants sat on benches, their hands restless, their shoulders heavy with the weight of outcomes that had already been decided before they even stepped inside. And among them all stood Officer Gerald Langley. Langley was a man who moved with the unchecked confidence of someone who had never been told no. His uniform was spotless, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but it wasn't the fabric or the metal that made him powerful, it was the certainty that he could do whatever he wanted and walk away untouched. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of stone, sharp features that might have been handsome if not for the permanent smirk that twisted his mouth, the kind of expression that told you he saw people as categories, not individuals, that he enjoyed reminding them where they stood. And when his eyes landed on Malik, something dark flickered behind them, something smug and familiar, something that made Malik's stomach tighten instinctively. Langley stepped forward, slow and measured, his boots heavy against the polished floor, each step deliberate in the way predators moved when they knew their prey had nowhere to run. He didn't have to say anything yet, the silence between them was already heavy with the unspoken. But then, as if savoring the moment, he tilted his head slightly, letting his gaze drop to the chain around Malik's neck, that small, defiant piece of gold that shone against his skin, a quiet declaration that he belonged. "You shouldn't be wearing something like that," Langley murmured, voice low, edged with something between condescension and warning, as if the very idea of Malik standing there, unafraid, offended him. Malik felt his jaw tighten, fingers brushing against the cool metal of the pendant, his heart beating faster but his face remaining still, unreadable. "Excuse me." The words were quiet, controlled, but beneath them was a tension Malik was barely holding back. Langley exhaled a small chuckle, shaking his head like he'd just heard something amusing, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Expensive gold like that? Doesn't belong on a kid like you. Where'd you steal it?" The accusation landed between them like a slap, but Malik had heard worse. His grip on the pendant tightened. "I didn't steal anything. This was my father's." Langley's smirk deepened, his fingers flexing slightly at his sides, his body language shifting ever so subtly into something even more possessive, as if he had already decided that whatever Malik claimed, it didn't matter. "Sure it was," he murmured, voice thick with mockery, and before Malik could process what was happening, before he could react, before anyone around them could speak, Langley reached forward and tore the chain from his neck. The snap of the metal breaking away was loud, deafening in its finality. The sensation was sharp, unexpected, a flash of pain where the pendant had scraped against his skin. But that wasn't what hurt the most. It was the emptiness, the absence, the way the space where the chain had rested now felt hollow, stripped away. Langley held the chain up between his fingers, letting it dangle in the air like a trophy, twisting the gold between his thumb and forefinger as if inspecting stolen goods, as if what he had just done was perfectly acceptable. "See, now this looks like something that belongs in an evidence locker," he mused, tilting his head slightly as if studying a piece of merchandise instead of a boy's last connection to his father. "And you? You look like you belong in a holding cell." Malik's breath came short and sharp, his fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had seen how this went. He had seen what happened to boys who reacted, who let their anger make the choices for them. He had learned to bite it back, to bury it deep, to pretend it didn't matter. But today, it did. And then, a shift. A change in the air, in the weight of the silence pressing down on the room. A hush fell over the space, not loud, but noticeable enough to make even Langley hesitate for a fraction of a second. And when he turned his head, when his gaze moved from Malik's face to the figure now standing just a few feet away, something inside him flickered. Because standing there, no longer just another bystander in this room, no longer a silent observer but a force about to bring the entire weight of justice crashing down upon him, was Judge Camille Carter. She didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes was enough. The slow, deliberate way she stepped forward, closing the space between them, made the courthouse walls feel smaller, the air thinner. Langley's smirk faltered, just slightly, just enough for the first cracks to appear in his confidence. But it was too late. Because in this moment, in the very courtroom where he thought he was untouchable, Officer Langley had just sealed his fate. And what was about to happen next would change everything. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing against the walls like an unseen force. Malik stood still, his breath shallow, his fists tight at his sides as the weight of humiliation settled over him like a lead blanket. The chain was gone, snatched from him without hesitation, without remorse. His skin still burned where the pendant had scraped against it, but the ache in his chest was deeper, rawer. He could feel the gazes of the room pressing into him, some sympathetic, some indifferent, others avoiding him entirely. It was always like this. People saw, but they never spoke. They witnessed, but they never intervened. Justice was only loud when it was convenient. Langley still held the chain between his fingers, spinning it absent-mindedly as if he had done nothing more than take a discarded trinket off the floor. His smirk remained, but there was something else now, a flicker of something unreadable when his eyes met Camille Carter's. She stood there, unmoving, her posture controlled but radiating an authority so heavy that even the room itself seemed to shrink beneath it. She had not spoken yet, and that silence was more unnerving than any words she could have unleashed. Langley exhaled a small chuckle, the sound forced, an attempt to regain control of the moment. He looked at Malik again, his eyes flickering between the boy and the judge standing just a few feet away. "What's the problem here, Your Honor?" His voice carried a lazy confidence, the kind that belonged to men who had never known real consequences. "Just doing my job." He held up the chain slightly, letting the gold catch the courtroom's harsh light, "looks a little suspicious, don't you think? Kid like this, walking around with something like this? Pretty bold move." Malik's pulse pounded in his ears. He felt a wave of heat rush through him, but he bit it back, locking his jaw so tight it ached. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to take back what was his, to snatch the chain from Langley's hand, to make him feel just an ounce of what he had inflicted. But he knew better. He had spent his entire life knowing better. Camille's voice cut through the room like a blade, smooth, unwavering, and dangerously quiet. "Officer Langley," she said, and that was all. Just his name. But the way she said it made even the clerk at the desk flinch. Langley hesitated, just for a second, and then he smiled again, adjusting his stance as if settling back into his usual rhythm. "Yes, ma'am." Camille took a step forward. Not rushed. Not aggressive. But there was weight in it, a shift in the air that made every single person in the room hold their breath. "Return the chain," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Langley blinked, just once, and then let out another laugh, shaking his head slightly. "Now, hold on, Judge Carter. I don't think you understand. This is a potential piece of evidence. Evidence of what?" Camille's words came out so sharply, so precise, that the air itself seemed to snap around them. Langley's smirk faltered, barely, but it was there. A crack. A small one, but undeniable. "Look, all I'm saying is, you are making an accusation against my son." Camille's voice remained even, but there was something beneath it now, something cold and sharp, something that promised devastation. "So, I will ask again, evidence of what, Officer Langley?" A flicker of something passed through Langley's eyes. Annoyance. Frustration. He hadn't expected pushback, not like this, not from a judge. He had spent his entire career in control, twisting situations until they suited him, bending narratives until they fit the story he wanted to tell. And now, that control was slipping through his fingers. His grip on the chain tightened. "Judge Carter, with all due respect, this is just standard procedure. If he can prove ownership, prove ownership." Camille interrupted, and now the edge in her voice was sharper, slicing through the false politeness Langley was trying to maintain. "You ripped that chain from my son's neck in a courtroom full of witnesses, and now you want him to prove it belongs to him?" Langley's jaw clenched, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. Not in front of all these people. "I was following protocol. Suspicious behavior, expensive jewelry, no immediate proof of ownership. You profiled him," Camille said, each word deliberate, controlled, lethal. "You saw a black boy wearing something of value and assumed it was stolen. You humiliated him in front of this entire courtroom. You violated his rights in a building dedicated to upholding them." The room was silent. The type of silence that felt suffocating. The type of silence that came when people knew they had just witnessed something they couldn't ignore. Langley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Camille took another step forward. "Return the chain." Langley's fingers twitched. He could feel the shift happening, the control slipping further away. But his pride, his authority, he couldn't just give in. Not like this. He had spent years operating in the shadows of unchecked power, pushing the limits because he knew he could get away with it. And yet, for the first time in a long time, something inside him felt off balance. His gaze flickered to Malik, who still stood silent, still burning with unspoken rage, still waiting. And in that moment, Langley understood something. This wasn't going to end the way it usually did. He forced another smirk, though it felt thinner now, weaker. He exhaled slowly, then, with a slight shake of his head, held the chain out toward Malik. "Fine," he muttered, though there was venom laced in the word. "Take it." Malik didn't move. Didn't trust it. Camille, however, reached forward and took the chain from Langley's grasp, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. She turned slightly, her gaze locking onto her son's as she placed the chain back into his hands. "Hold on to it," she murmured, and those 3 words carried more weight than any law Langley had ever tried to twist in his favor. But Camille wasn't done. Not yet. She turned back to Langley, and now her expression had shifted into something else entirely. Something quiet but lethal. "Officer Langley," she said, and now her voice carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "This conversation is far from over." Langley's smirk was gone. He knew. Everyone in the room knew. The storm was coming. And the next time Langley walked into this courtroom, he wouldn't be the one holding the power. He would be the one answering for it. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and unrelenting. The courtroom remained unervingly still, the kind of stillness that preceded something inevitable, something irreversible. Langley stood rigid, the smirk that had once sat so effortlessly on his face now gone, replaced with something colder, something uncertain. His jaw was tight, his posture forced, as though he was still trying to convince himself that he had control over this situation. But he didn't. Camille Carter had ensured that. She stood before him, her presence commanding yet composed, her expression unreadable but layered with something that only those who truly understood power could recognize, certainty. There was no hesitation in the way she looked at him, no flicker of doubt in her gaze. She had already decided what was about to happen next. Langley inhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back as if to reclaim some sense of control, his voice thick with an attempt at nonchalance. "Are we really doing this?" he muttered, his tone laced with forced amusement, though the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "All this over a chain?" Camille didn't blink, didn't flinch. "No," she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "All this over you." The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. There was a collective understanding that passed through the room, an awareness that this was no longer just about what had happened between Langley and Malik. This was about everything Langley had done before, about every time he had abused his authority and walked away untouched. Langley's fingers twitched slightly at his sides, his mouth opening as if he had something to say, some excuse to offer, some attempt at rationalizing what had just happened. But Camille didn't give him the chance. "You've operated for years under the belief that your badge is a shield," she continued, her voice even, deliberate. "That it protects you from consequences. That it gives you the right to humiliate, to violate, to take from those you see as beneath you." She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them, her voice lowering just slightly, carrying a dangerous weight. "But you made a mistake today, Officer Langley. A mistake that can't be ignored." Langley's lips parted, his breath heavier now, his skin taut with something that almost looked like fear. He tried to scoff, to brush it off, but it was weak, half-hearted. "And what exactly is my mistake, Judge Carter?" Camille's eyes never left his. "You did it in my courtroom." Langley's throat worked as he swallowed, his smirk struggling to hold. "You humiliated my son," Camille continued, her voice steady, her words like daggers carving into him. "You profiled him. You assaulted him. You committed theft, in front of witnesses, in front of court officials, on federal property." The silence that followed was suffocating. Langley shifted on his feet, the weight of the accusations settling into him, twisting into something uncomfortable, something he could no longer dismiss as easily as he once could. His eyes darted to Malik, to the boy who still stood silent, his hands tight around the chain, his face an unreadable mask of fury and restraint. Langley scoffed, but there was no real confidence behind it anymore. "This is ridiculous." It was a crime. Camille's words cut through his like steel, final and indisputable. "And for the first time, Officer Langley, you won't be walking away from it." Langley exhaled sharply, shifting, his body language screaming frustration. "Judge Carter, with all due respect." "There is no respect," Camille interrupted, her voice ice. "Not from me. Not from anyone in this room." And then, the doors opened. A pair of uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions neutral but their intent clear. Langley turned, his shoulders stiffening, his breath catching ever so slightly as realization sank into him like lead. Camille's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Gerald Langley, you are being placed under arrest for misconduct, unlawful seizure of personal property, and abuse of power." Langley's breath hitched. Malik could see it now, the way the color drained ever so slightly from Langley's face, the way his hands tensed at his sides, the way his jaw locked as if he was physically biting down the urge to react, to lash out, to deny this reality. The room felt smaller. The weight of what was happening pressed down on all of them. The officers moved forward. Langley took a step back. This is absurd, he hissed, his voice low, his mind working at an impossible speed to come up with a way out, an escape, an excuse that would make this disappear like every other time before. But this time, there was no out. Camille tilted her head ever so slightly. No, Officer Langley. What's absurd is that it took this long. One of the officers stepped beside Langley, his voice firm, procedural. Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back. Langley's breath was heavy, his jaw tightening as he felt the walls closing in. He turned toward Camille one last time, his voice cracking with something Malik couldn't quite place. This isn't over. Camille held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Yes, Officer Langley, she said, her voice quieter now, almost haunting in its certainty. It is. And then, in front of the very same people who had watched him wield his power so carelessly, Langley's own wrists were pulled behind his back, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs cutting through the silence. Malik watched, breathless, weightless, disbelieving. For the first time in his life, he was watching a man like Langley face what so many others had never been given, a consequence. Langley's shoulders were rigid, his body tense, his pride battling reality. But it didn't matter. Because this time, he had lost. The sharp clink of metal against metal echoed through the silent courtroom, a sound so final that it seemed to carve itself into the very air. Langley stood there, his arms locked behind his back, the cuffs pressing into his wrists. His breathing was uneven, a shallow, barely contained fury that burned beneath his skin. His entire body was stiff, shoulders squared, chest rising and falling in sharp, controlled inhales as if he were still trying to convince himself that this wasn't happening, that somehow, this was all some temporary inconvenience that he could maneuver his way out of. But he couldn't. Not this time. Malik stood a few feet away, his hands still curled tightly around the chain, his grip so firm it felt like the links might imprint themselves into his palm. His heart was racing, but he couldn't tell if it was from anger, disbelief, or something heavier, something that felt dangerously close to satisfaction. For so long, he had seen men like Langley walk away from moments like this unscathed, their actions excused, their crimes brushed aside with empty words and procedural loopholes. But today, in this courtroom, it was different. Today, power had shifted. Langley exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head as he tried to regain some semblance of composure, his voice low, strained, his tone laced with barely concealed venom. This is ridiculous, he hissed, his jaw tightening. Judge Carter, you know exactly what this is. A show. A spectacle. His eyes darkened as they flickered between Camille and Malik. All this because I called out what I saw. Camille didn't react. Not at first. She simply stood there, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm but edged with something cold, something unmovable. What you saw, she said slowly, each word deliberate, cutting, was a young black man wearing something you decided he didn't deserve. Her voice didn't waver, didn't rise. What you did was strip him of his dignity, in a place meant to uphold justice. Langley scoffed, rolling his shoulders as much as the cuffs allowed, his smirk returning in a bitter, hollow way. Dignity, he repeated, like the word itself was foreign to him. That's what this is about. A bruised ego? You're making this bigger than it is, Carter. You think you've won something here? His voice dropped, his eyes narrowing. The system is still the same. It doesn't change because of a courtroom spectacle. You're naive if you think otherwise. Malik felt something hot coil in his chest. His nails dug into his palm as he stepped forward, his voice sharp, controlled but filled with something raw. You say that like you're not the one in cuffs. Langley's head snapped toward him, his smirk twitching, but it wasn't confidence anymore, it was desperation masked as arrogance, a man grasping at the last fraying threads of control. Cuffs don't mean anything, he spat. You think this matters? You think they're actually going to let this stick? You don't know how the world works, kid. People like me, we don't fall. And people like you never win. The words should have stung, should have cut deep, but they didn't. Not this time. Because Malik knew something Langley didn't. He knew that this moment, this very moment, was already proof that men like Langley could fall. That their power wasn't absolute. That for the first time, he wasn't the one deciding how this story ended. Camille stepped closer, her eyes locked onto Langley's, steady and unwavering. You're right about one thing, she said, her voice quiet but sharp enough to slice through the tension like a blade. The system is the same. It's still broken. It still protects men like you. It still fails the people who need it the most. But today, in this room, the system didn't save you. Langley's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring as he struggled against the weight of the moment. His breathing had turned heavier, his shoulders tense, his hands curling into fists even as they remained bound behind him. The realization was sinking in now, burrowing deep, whether he wanted to accept it or not. You think this makes a difference, he snapped, his voice cracking slightly, just enough to betray his frustration. You think I'll sit in a cell for this? I've seen officers do worse and walk free. I've seen cases disappear before they even make it past booking. You think I don't have people watching my back? Camille didn't flinch, didn't falter. She let him speak, let him throw his final desperate punches at the air. And then, she spoke, her words measured, steady, final. You think that because you've never stood on this side of the law before, she said, tilting her head slightly, studying him as if he were something distant, something already fading into irrelevance. You believe in the invincibility of your power. You believe that no matter what happens, there will always be someone to protect you, someone to clean up your mess. But you made a mistake, Officer Langley. Langley held her gaze, but something in his expression wavered. You didn't just get caught, Camille continued, her voice a quiet storm building momentum, you got caught in the wrong place, in front of the wrong people, against the wrong family. Malik watched as something shifted in Langley's eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Not just anger, not just frustration, but true, tangible fear. You think you're untouchable, Camille said, taking another slow step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. But the only thing more dangerous than a corrupt system protecting you is when that same system decides you are no longer worth protecting. Langley's breath hitched. And then the doors opened again. More officers entered, along with a man in a sharp gray suit, a federal agent whose presence spoke volumes before he even said a word. He carried a folder in his hands, but it was the way his eyes locked onto Langley that told everyone in the room this wasn't just about today anymore. Langley turned his head slightly, eyes darting between the agent, the officers, Camille, and Malik. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outplayed. His entire world was closing in. The agent didn't hesitate. Officer Gerald Langley, he said, his voice crisp, official, carrying the weight of something much bigger than just a courtroom scuffle. You are under investigation for multiple violations, including excessive use of force, falsification of reports, coercion, and abuse of power. Effective immediately, your badge and firearm are revoked, and you are being taken into federal custody. The silence that followed was deafening. Langley inhaled sharply, his body going rigid, his mind racing through every possible escape, every loophole, every person he could call, but there was nothing. This wasn't just a courtroom arrest anymore. This was something bigger. Something permanent. Malik stood there, watching as the weight of Langley's downfall settled over the room, as the power that had once seemed so indestructible crumbled right before his eyes. And for the first time in his life, Malik saw justice, real justice, unfold right in front of him. Langley's voice was barely above a whisper now, his bravado slipping with every passing second. You don't understand, Camille exhaled softly, shaking her head. No, Officer Langley, she said, her voice calm, almost pitying. It's you who doesn't understand. And with that, the officers took him by the arms, leading him away, his footsteps heavy against the courtroom floor. And just like that, he was gone. The courtroom felt different now, as if the air had shifted, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Gerald Langley was gone, dragged away in the tight grip of justice that had finally wrapped itself around him. But even as his footsteps faded, the echoes of his downfall still clung to the room like an electric charge, humming in the silence that followed. Malik stood in the center of it all, his breath still uneven, his grip still firm around the chain that had been ripped from him, then returned. His pulse was slowing now, but his mind was still racing, still processing the moment, still trying to believe that what he had just seen wasn't some fleeting illusion, that for once, justice had not turned away. Camille Carter remained poised, standing in the place where she had delivered the final blow, her face composed, unreadable. She had seen many cases, had watched many men sit in the same chair Langley had sat in, had delivered sentences that sealed fates with the stroke of a gavel. But this was different. This wasn't just another case, another moment where the law worked as it was supposed to. This was personal. This was a reckoning long overdue. And yet, as much as she had wanted to see this day, as much as she had waited for a moment where a man like Langley would face consequences, there was something unsettling in the aftermath. The thrill of seeing him fall did not erase the years of damage men like him had done. It did not undo the scars left behind. Malik turned the chain over in his hands, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the pendant. It felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning. It wasn't just something that belonged to him anymore, it was a symbol of what had almost been taken, of what had been fought for, of what had finally been restored. And yet, as he looked at it, as he felt the warmth of the gold in his palm, something inside him felt uneasy. He thought he would feel victorious, that watching Langley walk out in cuffs would fill the void that had been gnawing at him for years. But it didn't. It wasn't enough. He exhaled slowly, his voice lower, more distant than he expected when he finally spoke. Is that it? The question hung in the air between them, quiet but sharp, cutting through the fading tension of the room. Camille turned toward him, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. What do you mean? She asked, though she already had a feeling she knew. Malik lifted his gaze to meet hers, his expression a mixture of something unresolved, something unsettled. He gets arrested. He faces charges. Maybe he goes to prison for a few years, maybe not. But then what? His voice was steady, but the frustration underneath it was undeniable. People like him don't just disappear. They don't just stop existing because they finally get caught. How many more Langleys are out there? How many more people walk into a courtroom every day thinking they can do whatever they want because they know they'll get away with it? Camille's lips pressed together slightly, her posture remaining composed but her eyes softening. She had spent her entire career inside these walls, trying to balance a system that had never been built for people like them, trying to hold men like Langley accountable while knowing that for everyone who fell, dozens more took their place. She had learned to take victories where she could, to find solace in the small moments where justice actually worked, even if it was imperfect. But she understood her son's frustration, understood the deep, aching exhaustion of knowing that today was just one battle in an endless war. You're right, she admitted finally, her voice quieter now, as if she was speaking not just to him but to something larger, something beyond the walls of this room. One arrest doesn't fix the system. One conviction doesn't erase the damage that's been done. There will always be another Langley, another fight to be had. She let out a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. But today, we didn't let him win. Today, he was forced to answer for what he did. And that matters. Malik exhaled, looking down at the chain again. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that this moment would last, that it would change something, anything. But deep down, he knew that Langley wasn't unique. He was a symptom, not the disease. Across the room, a few people had started murmuring again, the weight of the moment slowly settling, people shifting, moving, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Some eyes lingered on Camille, on Malik, on the spot where Langley had stood. Others looked away, uncomfortable, uncertain. Even now, even after everything, there were those who wouldn't say anything, who wouldn't acknowledge what had just happened. Camille noticed it too, the way some people quickly busied themselves with paperwork, the way certain officers kept their gazes fixed straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge that one of their own had been taken away in cuffs. The silence from some corners of the room was just as loud as the murmurs from others. There were still people in this courthouse who didn't think Langley had done anything wrong. Malik saw it too. His jaw tightened. "They still don't get it," he muttered, his voice tinged with something bitter. Camille followed his gaze, understanding immediately. "Some of them never will." She turned to face him fully, tilting her head slightly. "But they're not the ones who matter. You are. The people who fight are. The ones who refuse to let it happen again are. We don't do this for the ones who won't change, we do this for the ones who can." Malik let those words sit for a moment, rolling them over in his mind. He knew his mother was right. Change didn't happen all at once. It didn't come in one grand victory, in one single moment of justice. It came in persistence, in refusing to back down, in pushing even when it felt impossible. But still, the unease remained. His fingers closed around the chain again, his grip firmer now, more certain. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but heavier. "I just don't want to wait for the next one." Camille nodded slowly, a flicker of something deep in her eyes, pride, understanding, the quiet pain of a mother who had always known this day would come. "Neither do I," she admitted. "But the only way to stop it is to keep going. To keep fighting." Malik let out another slow breath, and for the first time since Langley had been taken away, something inside him felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because now, he knew he wasn't alone in it. The courtroom continued to shift around them, the energy changing, settling into something different. There was still so much left unfinished, so much left unsaid, but for now, this moment was theirs. And whatever came next, they would be ready. The weight of the moment still hung in the air, thick and unshaken, like a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. The courtroom had resumed its slow return to normalcy, but the tension remained, lingering in the silence, in the glances exchanged, in the way some people hurried to move past what had just happened while others remained frozen, absorbing the magnitude of it. Malik stood there, the chain still wrapped in his fingers, its weight solid and grounding. He turned it over in his palm, the cool metal pressing against his skin, a reminder of what had been taken from him, what had been returned, and what it truly meant. He had come into this courthouse expecting just another day in a system he had never trusted, but now he was standing in the aftermath of something no one had seen coming. Camille watched him, studying the way his shoulders held tension, the way his expression remained locked in thought. She recognized that look. She had seen it before, on faces of men who had spent their whole lives fighting battles they had never asked for. It was the look of someone who should feel victorious but didn't. Someone who knew that winning one fight didn't mean the war was over. Her son was only 16, and yet, she could already see the weight of history settling into him, pressing down, making him question if what had happened here today would really change anything. She stepped closer, her voice calm but deliberate, the way it always was when she needed him to hear her, not just listen. "Malik, what happened today?" He didn't let her finish. His voice was quieter than before, but sharp, carrying the edge of emotions he wasn't sure how to process. "Did it even matter?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, looking down at the chain again as if searching for an answer in the links. "I mean, really? They took him away, sure. But how long before he's out? How long before he's back somewhere else, with a different badge, doing the same thing to someone else?" His grip tightened. "How long before another Langley steps in to take his place?" Camille held his gaze, her expression unwavering, but there was something softer in her eyes now. "It mattered," she said firmly, and then, more quietly, but I know why you don't feel like it does. Malik let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. It's just, he exhaled sharply, the frustration rising again, thick and uncontainable. They still looked at me the same. The people in that room, the ones who saw what he did, the ones who knew he was wrong, they still looked at me like I was the problem. Like I was just some kid with a chip on his shoulder, making too much noise about something they thought wasn't that serious. His jaw clenched, his voice harder now. They weren't shocked by what he did. They were just shocked he got caught. Camille's lips pressed together, not in disapproval, but in understanding. She had lived in this world long enough to know that her son wasn't wrong. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about perception. And for too many people in that room, Langley's actions weren't the anomaly, his consequences were. She stepped closer, reaching out, her fingers grazing his wrist, grounding him in the way only a mother could. That's why we keep fighting, she said. Because if we don't, nothing changes. Because they expect us to give up, to accept that the system is broken beyond repair. But we don't. We fight anyway. Malik swallowed, his throat tight, emotions rising and crashing against him like waves. And what if it's never enough? She sighed, tilting her head slightly, considering him. Then we fight anyway, she repeated, her voice steady, unshaken. Because if we stop, then they win. And that's not an option. The words settled between them, weighty, real. Malik wanted to believe them. He wanted to take the fire that still burned inside him and turn it into something useful, something more than just anger without direction. But it was hard. It was so hard to stand in the aftermath of something like this and not feel like it was just another scene in an endless loop. A voice cut through the moment, hesitant but firm. Judge Carter. They both turned. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s, stood near the back of the courtroom, gripping a notepad tightly in her hands. She had been there the whole time, watching, listening. She was a court reporter, one of the people who wasn't supposed to react, who was meant to simply document and observe. But now, she was stepping forward, her eyes flickering between Camille and Malik, her throat working as if she was struggling to find the right words. She hesitated, then shook her head, her voice stronger when she spoke again. I just wanted to say that I saw it. What happened? And I know it's not my place, but... She let out a breath, shaking her head again as if trying to clear her thoughts. It's the first time I've seen someone like him actually be held accountable. I've seen things happen in this building that never make it into a report, never get acknowledged, never lead to anything. But today, it did. She looked at Malik now, really looked at him. And you made that happen. Malik blinked, thrown by the words, by the sincerity in them. He wasn't used to hearing things like that from people who didn't have to say them. He didn't even know how to respond. The woman gave a small, almost apologetic smile before glancing back at Camille. I just thought you should know that some of us saw it. And that it mattered. With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the floor, leaving behind a silence that felt different now. Malik let out a slow breath, his grip on the chain loosening just slightly. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this wasn't the victory. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Camille watched him, her lips curving slightly in the smallest hint of a smile, before she placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. Come on, she said, her voice softer now, almost motherly again. Let's go home. Malik nodded, slipping the chain back around his neck, feeling its weight settle against him once more. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a reminder. The courthouse doors felt heavier as Malik and Camille stepped outside, as if they were pushing against more than just wood and metal, as if they were pushing against the weight of everything that had just happened inside. The air was thick, the Atlanta heat pressing down on them, wrapping around their skin like a second layer. The city moved on around them, cars speeding by, people walking, life continuing as if nothing inside that courtroom had changed the course of a man's life. But Malik knew better. Something had shifted. Something had cracked. And even if the rest of the world didn't know it yet, he did. His fingers brushed against the chain resting on his chest, feeling the familiar shape of the pendant pressing into his skin. It felt different now, heavier, but not in the way it had before. This wasn't the weight of loss or grief anymore. This was the weight of knowing. Of understanding that power, real power, wasn't in the system, wasn't in the hands of men like Langley. It was in moments like this, in refusing to let injustice stand without a fight. But that didn't mean it was easy. Camille walked beside him, silent at first, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She didn't rush him, didn't fill the air with meaningless words. She knew her son well enough to recognize when he needed space to process, to breathe. But after a few moments, she finally spoke, her voice steady but warm. "You did good today." Malik exhaled slowly, staring straight ahead as they walked. "Did I?" His voice wasn't bitter, but it wasn't convinced either. "Because I don't know if it feels that way." Camille glanced at him, a knowing look in her eyes. "You think justice should feel like relief," she said, more of an observation than a question. "Like something final, something clean." She shook her head slightly. "But it never does. It's messy, it's complicated. It never feels like enough because it isn't. One man being held accountable doesn't erase what he's done. It doesn't fix the system that let him do it in the first place." Malik let out a small, humorless laugh, nodding. "Exactly. So how do you keep going? How do you sit in that chair, in that courtroom, knowing it's just one fight in an endless war?" Camille was quiet for a moment, as if weighing her words. Then, finally, she sighed. "Because sometimes, all you need is one win to remind you that it's worth fighting at all." She looked at him again, her gaze firm. "And today was a win." Malik chewed on her words, letting them settle, feeling them press into the parts of him that were still raw. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it easier. "It just doesn't feel real yet," he admitted, shaking his head. Langley spent years doing whatever he wanted, knowing nothing would happen to him. And now, in one day, it all came crashing down. It almost feels too simple. Camille let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "That's because it wasn't simple," she corrected. "It took years of men like him getting away with it before today could even happen. It took the right people in the right place, the right moment, the right pressure." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "And it took you standing your ground." Malik scoffed lightly. "All I did was get humiliated in front of a courtroom full of people." Camille stopped walking, turning toward him, forcing him to stop too. Her expression was serious now, the way it was when she needed him to really listen. "No. You refuse to let it break you," she said, her voice softer but filled with conviction. "You refuse to stay silent. You refuse to let him walk away like it didn't matter. And whether you realize it or not, that's why he lost today. Not because of me, not because of the law, but because of you." Malik swallowed hard, looking down for a second, feeling the way her words pressed into something deep inside him, something he hadn't even fully acknowledged yet. It wasn't just about the system failing. It was about him deciding not to be another victim swept under the rug. A voice interrupted the moment. "Malik." Both of them turned. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, dressed in jeans and a simple t-shirt, was jogging toward them from across the street, his face familiar but out of place here. Malik's eyes narrowed slightly in recognition before it clicked. Jared. A guy from his neighborhood, someone who had always been around but never someone he had spoken to much. Why was he here? Jared slowed as he reached them, his breath slightly heavy but his expression urgent. "Man, I was inside. I saw everything," he said quickly, his voice filled with something Malik couldn't quite place yet. I can't believe you stood up to him like that. Malik frowned slightly. I didn't really have a choice, he muttered, glancing away. Jared shook his head. Nah, man, you don't get it. Most people, he exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Most of us. We just take it. We let it happen because we know fighting back won't change anything. But you did something. And now he's gone. You don't even understand what that means. Malik felt his stomach tighten slightly, caught off guard by the weight in Jared's words. He had expected people to have opinions about what happened today, but he hadn't expected this. Jared's eyes flickered between him and Camille before he spoke again, his voice lower now, more controlled. Langley's been harassing people in our neighborhood for years. Stopping kids on the street for no reason, making threats, planting shit. Nobody could do anything about it. And now, he shook his head, exhaling sharply. Now he's finally gone. Because of you. Malik stared at him, something churning in his chest, something he wasn't sure how to name. He had always thought of Langley as one problem in a bigger system, someone who had power but wasn't personally significant in the grand scheme of things. But now, hearing Jared say it, hearing how many people had suffered because of that man, he realized, this wasn't just about him. This was about all of them. Camille watched the exchange, silent but attentive, letting Malik process the weight of what he was hearing. Jared's voice softened slightly. Look, man, I just wanted to say thank you, he said. Not just for you. For everybody. Malik inhaled slowly, his grip on the chain tightening again. He didn't know what to say. He had never thought of himself as someone who changed anything, never thought one moment could ripple out like this. But maybe that was the point. Maybe change didn't come in one big wave. Maybe it started like this, one moment at a time. Jared gave him a nod before stepping back, glancing at Camille. You raised a real one, Judge Carter. Camille smiled, small but genuine. I know. Jared turned and walked away, disappearing into the moving city, leaving Malik standing there, feeling different than he had just minutes ago. He turned to his mother, exhaling. Maybe it did matter, he admitted, his voice quieter now, more certain. Camille smiled again, touching his arm lightly. It always does. And as they finally started walking away, Malik felt it. Not relief. Not victory. But purpose. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Malik had ever experienced. The courtroom, once a place he had resented, a place where he had seen too many people who looked like him fall victim to a system that was never meant to protect them, had become something else entirely. It had become the place where he had fought back and won. The weight of that victory still sat in his chest, heavy and undeniable, but it wasn't a burden, it was something else. Something that reminded him that power wasn't just in who controlled the law, but in who refused to be crushed by it. Langley's arrest had set off a chain reaction. Investigations that had once been buried under stacks of ignored reports were being reopened. Witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak were coming forward. The stories of people he had harassed, intimidated, even falsely arrested, were surfacing, one after another, like cracks in a dam finally giving way. Malik had never imagined that his name would be attached to something this big, that his refusal to back down that day in the courtroom would become the spark that lit an entire fire. The last time he had seen Langley, the former officer had been escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, his face pale with disbelief, his body tense with the kind of anger that came from a man who had never expected to face consequences. Malik had watched him go, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. Langley had spent years believing himself untouchable. Now, he was just another name in the system he had once used to control others. And it didn't stop there. The department was facing scrutiny. Officers who had once stood by Langley, who had laughed along with him, who had looked the other way, were now facing their own investigations. Some had already resigned, others were fighting to keep their badges, scrambling to distance themselves from a man they had once protected. It was the kind of shift Malik had never thought he'd live to see. One afternoon, as he walked home, his phone buzzed with a message from Jared. "You see the news? They fired 3 more today. Man, you really did that." Malik stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He still wasn't sure how to feel about it all. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some activist who had set out to change the world. He had just refused to be another name in a long list of victims. One evening, Camille found him sitting on the porch, the city lights stretching out beyond them, the quiet hum of the neighborhood filling the space between them. She sat beside him without a word, simply watching him, letting the silence settle. Then, after a moment, she spoke. "You're still thinking about it," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she already knew. Malik exhaled, running a hand over his face before nodding. "It just doesn't feel real." He looked down at the chain hanging around his neck. "None of it does." Camille leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "That's because change never feels real when it's happening," she said. "It feels impossible until suddenly, it's not." Malik turned his head toward her, studying her face. "Did you ever think something like this would happen?" She let out a slow breath, considering his words carefully before answering. "Not like this," she admitted. "I've spent my whole career trying to fix things from the inside, knowing that for every battle I win, there are 100 more waiting. But this?" She glanced at him, a small smile touching her lips. "I didn't see this coming. And I'm glad I didn't, because it means the world is still capable of surprising me." Malik nodded, letting that thought settle. He had spent so long believing that nothing would ever change, that the system was too big, too designed to break people like him. And yet, here he was. The proof that sometimes, even the most immovable things could be forced to shift. Later that night, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection. He traced the chain with his fingers, feeling the familiar ridges of the pendant, the warmth of the metal against his skin. His father had worn this once. He had carried its weight, its meaning. And now, it was Malik's turn. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel powerless. He didn't feel small. He felt like he could be something more. And that was just the beginning. This story isn't just about one moment. It's about something bigger. It's about what happens when people decide not to be silent. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept that things can't change. Because change doesn't come all at once, it comes in moments, in choices, in the people who refuse to back down, even when the world tells them to. Malik Carter didn't walk into that courtroom expecting to start something. But that's the thing about standing up for yourself, sometimes, it sparks something bigger than you. Sometimes, one moment of defiance is enough to bring down everything that was built to keep you in your place. So ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have let the world tell you that it wasn't worth it? Because moments like these aren't just fiction. They're happening every day. And the question is, will you be the one who stands, or the one who looks away? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you realize that justice isn't given, it's taken, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this. Stories that challenge, that shake you, that make you question everything you thought you knew. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next twist might be the one you never saw coming. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Malik had ever experienced. The courtroom, once a place he had resented, a place where he had seen too many people who looked like him fall victim to a system that was never meant to protect them, had become something else entirely. It had become the place where he had fought back and won. The weight of that victory still sat in his chest, heavy and undeniable, but it wasn't a burden, it was something else. Something that reminded him that power wasn't just in who controlled the law, but in who refused to be crushed by it. Langley's arrest had set off a chain reaction. Investigations that had once been buried under stacks of ignored reports were being reopened. Witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak were coming forward. The stories of people he had harassed, intimidated, even falsely arrested, were surfacing, one after another, like cracks in a dam finally giving way. Malik had never imagined that his name would be attached to something this big, that his refusal to back down that day in the courtroom would become the spark that lit an entire fire. The last time he had seen Langley, the former officer had been escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, his face pale with disbelief, his body tense with the kind of anger that came from a man who had never expected to face consequences. Malik had watched him go, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. Langley had spent years believing himself untouchable. Now, he was just another name in the system he had once used to control others. And it didn't stop there. The department was facing scrutiny. Officers who had once stood by Langley, who had laughed along with him, who had looked the other way, were now facing their own investigations. Some had already resigned, others were fighting to keep their badges, scrambling to distance themselves from a man they had once protected. It was the kind of shift Malik had never thought he'd live to see. One afternoon, as he walked home, his phone buzzed with a message from Jared. "You see the news? They fired 3 more today. Man, you really did that." Malik stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He still wasn't sure how to feel about it all. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some activist who had set out to change the world. He had just refused to be another name in a long list of victims. One evening, Camille found him sitting on the porch, the city lights stretching out beyond them, the quiet hum of the neighborhood filling the space between them. She sat beside him without a word, simply watching him, letting the silence settle. Then, after a moment, she spoke. "You're still thinking about it," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she already knew. Malik exhaled, running a hand over his face before nodding. "It just doesn't feel real." He looked down at the chain hanging around his neck. "None of it does." Camille leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "That's because change never feels real when it's happening," she said. "It feels impossible until suddenly, it's not." Malik turned his head toward her, studying her face. "Did you ever think something like this would happen?" She let out a slow breath, considering his words carefully before answering. "Not like this," she admitted. "I've spent my whole career trying to fix things from the inside, knowing that for every battle I win, there are 100 more waiting. But this?" She glanced at him, a small smile touching her lips. "I didn't see this coming. And I'm glad I didn't, because it means the world is still capable of surprising me." Malik nodded, letting that thought settle. He had spent so long believing that nothing would ever change, that the system was too big, too designed to break people like him. And yet, here he was. The proof that sometimes, even the most immovable things could be forced to shift. Later that night, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection. He traced the chain with his fingers, feeling the familiar ridges of the pendant, the warmth of the metal against his skin. His father had worn this once. He had carried its weight, its meaning. And now, it was Malik's turn. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel powerless. He didn't feel small. He felt like he could be something more. And that was just the beginning. This story isn't just about one moment. It's about something bigger. It's about what happens when people decide not to be silent. It's about what happens when someone refuses to accept that things can't change. Because change doesn't come all at once, it comes in moments, in choices, in the people who refuse to back down, even when the world tells them to. Malik Carter didn't walk into that courtroom expecting to start something. But that's the thing about standing up for yourself, sometimes, it sparks something bigger than you. Sometimes, one moment of defiance is enough to bring down everything that was built to keep you in your place. So ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have let the world tell you that it wasn't worth it? Because moments like these aren't just fiction. They're happening every day. And the question is, will you be the one who stands, or the one who looks away? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, if it made you realize that justice isn't given, it's taken, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this. Stories that challenge, that shake you, that make you question everything you thought you knew. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next twist might be the one you never saw coming.